for you.
So as we get started here, want to just invite everybody, if you want to share your name and your program that you're with in the chat box, feel free to share that with each other. If you don't have paper and a pen handy, you might want to take a second and grab that. There may be some notes you want to take during this training. If you happen to have the center-based regulation book with you that has the revised regulations in it, that might also be handy. And I'm seeing we have people from all over the state with us tonight, so it's great to have everybody joining us. So to go over the learning objectives for tonight, we're going to spend some time just kind of increasing understanding of the center-based regulation revisions that apply to all center-based programs. We're going to work on becoming familiar with the center-based regulation revisions that really only apply to center-based programs that are actually located in a public and/or independent school building. And then we'll also share different resources that are available to you to support you with complying with the regulations. So as of September 1st, these revised regulations went into effect. And all center-based programs have until December 1st to read and fully understand the revised regulations. This revision project actually stemmed from an identified need to streamline regulations for public school pre-kindergarten programs. So from September of 2018 until April of 2019, we had a work group with a variety of public school pre-kindergarten stakeholders that met monthly and reviewed over 75 center-based regulations and made recommendations to either revise a regulation or keep it the same. In order to really identify the regulations that we were going to look at as part of that work group, they came from two places. One came from feedback from the work group members themselves, but the other place came from a survey that we have on our CDD website. So if you go to the CDD website on the laws and regulations page, there is a survey in the middle of the page. So anytime someone has a regulation they think should be revised or is problematic in some way, you can always go in there and enter it into the survey. And when we look at revising regulations, we pull all of the survey results and have them inform the revision process. So that's how we identified which rules we would really focus and take a look on. And the division adopted most all of the recommendations that the work group made and began the formal promulgation process. In addition to revisions that the work group identified, there was also some other revisions that we made to align regulations with federal requirements and Vermont statute changes that had happened since 2016, as well as to address regulation corrections that had been identified as being needed. So for our first poll question, before we jump right in here, just wondering, is your program located in a public or independent school building? And we'll post that poll question for you to fill out. I'm waiting for the few more responses. You almost have everybody. All right, so it looks like we have a fairly balanced group tonight. So about almost half of you are, a little less than half of you are located in public or independent school buildings, and the others are in other community locations. I do see that there is at least one hand up. I saw a couple hands go up and then one hand went down. If you have something you want to say, you want to put that right in the chat box. If you want to ask a question, put that right in the question and answer box. So that will help get them to us. And yes, some of you are probably definitely located in school buildings, but are private center-based programs. So we have a mixture of that as well. So the first thing I would like to start with is in the table of contents, there is a section of the regulations that are really specific to particular programs. And the two particular programs that this applies to is non-recurring care services. So that's a program that is primarily supporting children that do not attend on a regular basis. So a common example is a ski resort where a family might be visiting either from within state or out of state and want to use childcare during their trip. So that's non-recurring care services. And the second is public school pre-kindergarten programs. So those are two pre-existing sections of the regulations. And before we revise these regulations in the section 8.2 for public school pre-kindergarten programs, there was only a couple exceptions. And then after this regulation revision process, we increased it from about 2 to about 10. Still not a lot, because a lot of what we decided to make for revisions were revisions that really should apply to either all center-based programs or revisions that should apply to center-based programs that are actually located in school buildings, because the nature of the location was different. And so it made sense to make a specific exception. So while there was lots of rules that we revised, there was really very few that we still put in this particular section. But to give you a sense of the types of exceptions that are in section 8.1 and 8.2, there are basically two types of exceptions. The first one, if you look at rule 8.1.8, so this is an exception that applies to non-recurring care programs. This rule just completely exempts that type of center-based program from a particular regulation. And in this instance, it is exempt from having to collect immunization information. The other type of exception that you would find in this is rule 8.2.6, which doesn't exempt a program from having to follow the rule completely, but it does change what they have to do. So in 8.2.6, it says a public school pre-kindergarten program is exempt from the rule 5.11.2.2 of these regulations. However, the licensee shall ensure that the meals and snacks provided meet, and then it tells you what it needs to meet. Really minor revision here, but we changed the word from, instead of saying the program director shall ensure, we changed it to the licensee, recognizing that there is a different business structure in center-based programs that are operated by public schools. And so they really felt like licensee was a more appropriate term that should be used. So two different types. One exempts them completely from the rule. The other makes some kind of modification to the rule. So we can jump right into some of the types of revisions that we made. In this particular rule, this is an example of a rule in which we were just updating language. So since 2016, Northern Lights had changed their name, and so we wanted to reflect that name change in the regulation. So now they're called Northern Lights at Community College of Vermont. And there are other edits. I won't spend time tonight going through every regulation where there was some type of change, whether it's grammatical. There was a couple places where we had a typo. There was other places where we updated a name title. So we won't go through all of those, but that was definitely one type of revision that we made.
So we did have one question come through related to the previous slide, just clarifying that the licensee is the one who makes sure that the director follows the rule. So it's worded, so the licensee makes sure the director follows the rule, question mark.
So in rule 5.11.2.2, that would apply to your programs as center-based programs. It says the program director shall ensure that the meals and snacks provided meet the child and adult care food program. In this exception for public school pre-kindergarten programs, it's actually saying the licensee does that work.
And I think it was a related question of sort of ultimately the licensee's the one who's responsible for making sure
Yeah.
things happen.
Yeah, so if you're trying to understand the relationship between the licensee and the program director, the licensee ultimately is responsible for ensuring compliance with all regulations and how their program is being operated. The reason we did this word change here was really because in a public school building, it's really the administration's responsibility as compared to the program director's responsibility. It's just how they delineate who does what. And so it was out of respect for recognizing that delineation. Whereas in a center-based program in the community, you might find that the licensee is not on site, so they're not the one ensuring it. It's the program director who maybe is buying the food and preparing the meals and planning the menus. And so it tends to be more of a program director responsibility. Okay. So this regulation, we did have a lot of conversations. So under the former center-based regulations, staff employed by another entity were strictly defined as partner staff. And so the first sentence here, where it says staff means all persons employed by or substituting at the center-based program as a program director, teacher, teacher associate, teacher assistant, trainee, classroom aide, or seasonal staff. That's who is defined as staff. Everybody else who wasn't employed by the program was considered partner staff. And what we found from that regulation revision in 2016 is that we had programs that had contractual relationships with another entity. For example, I think the common example I often use is Head Start might have a contractual relationship with a public school. Head Start might hold the license, but under the contract, the public school would actually provide the second teacher to work in that classroom. And so as a result of those contractual relationships, what we were seeing after the 2016 revision was variances coming in requesting that that partner staff under that contractual relationship be defined as staff and therefore be responsible for all the same things as staff, including fingerprinting and professional development and qualifications, but also then being able to count in ratio and be left alone with children. So based on what we were seeing from how people were applying the regulations and how that worked or didn't work, what we decided to do was add this second half of the regulation where we say, if the licensee, such as Head Start, has a contractual relationship with another entity, such as a school supervisory union, to provide an individual to the licensee to serve as staff within the licensee center-based program and who will not be employed by the licensee, then these individuals may be defined as staff. So it allows for what we were giving for variances, and it just builds it into the rule. And this is an example of a revision that sits within the body of the regulation, and so it applies to all center-based programs, regardless of where you're located. What is probably key pieces to note of this revision is that whether or not that person is defined as staff or as partner staff is at the discretion of the licensed center-based program. It requires that documentation of the contractual relationship be on site. And then when this definition is being used, the center-based program is required to have these staff members fill out a record check authorization form circling the staff position for which they're filling, whether that's teacher, teacher associate, teacher assistant. And then these staff must follow all regulations that apply to staff, fingerprinting, annual professional development. And I guess this is a good time for the second poll question. Do you think this is a rule you may use? Give a minute for a few more people to vote. All right. So there's definitely a little bit more than 50% of the people feel like they would potentially use this regulation. If you have questions about this regulation and how to use it, especially if you've never had a variance for this or don't have experience using it, you can always feel free to talk to your licensor or the licensor on duty line. The next type of revisions that we focused on was revisions that improve inclusion of children and families. So there was several places where we made some adjustments to improve inclusion. The first one was in Rule 3441, and that's the rule that talks about what's needed in a child's enrollment file. And now that rule has a requirement that there is a line that identifies what the child's home language is. It's really hard to know if you need to have interpreter services or other supports if you don't know what the family's home language is. And so we've added that in the enrollment file. The next rule was rule section 5.9. So section 5.9 is actually a header. And the header used to say children with special health needs and disabilities. And we added to that header, and now it says children with special health needs and disabilities and English language learners. So again, just to be more inclusive. And then there's two rules in this section, Rule 592 and 593, that now require staff to plan for how they will include English language learners in their classrooms and how they'll adapt or accommodate for their needs. And then the last rule that is related to this topic is Rule 510.1.13.2. And that's the rule that identifies the emergency phone numbers you need to have posted, and it requires an interpreter service phone number to be included in the posted phone numbers when applicable. So if you don't have anybody in your program that has a home language other than English, then you may not have an interpreter service listed. But if you do, then we would expect you to identify an interpreter service that you would use in corresponding with that family if that was needed. And you would have that number posted and handy for staff to use.
So there's a question around home language. Can the home language question wait until renewal, or do we need to have an immediate update?
So you have until like December 1st to identify the rules that you need to come into compliance with and to address those. I don't know that you necessarily need to ask families to submit a new form, but you could ask families to let you know, and you could just write it in on their enrollment form. So as you're kind of mulling this over, I have a question for all of you. And just as you think about these revisions, what changes do you think you may need to make? So it sounds like people are already thinking about how to handle that enrollment form. Any other revisions you foresee making based on some of these revisions?
So another question came in, what if we have staff on site who speak those languages? Do we still need to post interpreter contact info?
So, I always think about that question from an emergency response perspective. It's great that you have somebody on site. What if they're not there? What if they're out sick, or there's a medical emergency that's impacted them, or they're on vacation? You always want to make sure that you still have an interpreter service you could use should you need it, especially in an emergency. If the family, if their child has had something happen to them, it's really important that they be able to understand what's happening. And if that person's, for whatever reasons, or that couple people you may have isn't working, then you're definitely going to want to be able to connect to an interpreter.
Another question, what if families use a home language at home, however, they only want their children speaking English at school? Does that need to be documented?
Well, this is really about inclusion. So you really want to think about it from the perspective of how are you best going to support that family, feeling included, recognized, supporting children's development and learning, and supporting the communication with the family so that they feel like they understand what's happening. So I think those are the pieces you really want to think about. And also think about your communication mechanisms around how do families let you know if they feel like they need something. You might think that they're all set. They might not feel like that need is being met. How can they let you know that? And how do you respond to that when they do share that with you? I think those are the kinds of things I think about when I try to balance how well we're meeting the family's needs and the children's needs.
So another person has a family culture survey where they ask about home language, and they're wondering if that is sufficient to meet the rule.
Yep. If it's in the child, if you can put that in the child's file. So the regulation really doesn't say like what form, like it has to be on the same paper or a different paper, it has to be on enrollment form versus a home culture family survey. We're really just looking that you have that information collected in the child's file and able to be utilized and shared with staff.
And then another question, does this apply to bilingual families?
It does. Mm-hmm.
And another person's asking for clarification on the 512, or the 592 revision.
And what's the clarification question?
It just, can you revisit the 592 revision for me?
So 592 is really about making classrooms inclusive for English language learners. I'm trying to flip to it right now. So staff shall plan for the full and successful inclusion of children with special healthcare needs, disabilities, and/or English language learners. An individual child's plan shall be developed with the child's parents and staff. The plan shall address any health or other particular needs of the child.
Great. So the revision was adding in the English language learners to the existing rule. Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you. That's everything about this particular topic.
Okay, great. Any other feedback on if anyone sees any changes they would make to their program based on these revisions?
Someone in the chat mentioned updating their enrollment form.
Mm-hmm. All right. So just trying to get us thinking. So here's another regulation revision. This rule had been in section 8.2, and 8.2 is the section that is exemptions for public school pre-kindergarten programs. And one of the things that we try to look at is if a rule is valid for a program or for children, then really is it valid for all programs and all children? And if so, we really want it in the body of the regulation, and we want it to be the same for after school programs as well as center-based programs or family child care home programs. So when we were doing this revision and we looked at this rule, we really realized that there was no reason why it couldn't apply to all center-based programs. So we moved it out of section 8.2 and we put it in the body of the regulation. So this applies to all center-based programs, and it allows you to have a legally notarized affidavit on site testifying that each personnel file required contains all the required documents. So this might be particularly handy if there is a licensee that has multiple sites. And so you keep personnel records off site in one central location instead of having them duplicated at all sites. That's an example of one way a program might utilize this. The other change that was made to this revision is that previously it was specific to staff files, and we opened it up to apply to staff files, auxiliary staff files, and partner staff files. So two different ways this rule was revised. Okay. So the next rule is the rule that talks about within 6 months of initial date of employment, staff have BFIS quality and credential accounts that are up to date with qualifications and stays up to date with annual professional development activities. And the revision that was made here was, we added this language about it also applying to auxiliary staff left alone with children and or counted in staff-child ratio. Now I'm going to talk about in the next slide the definition, well, not the definition, but how auxiliary staff can or can't be used within a program. But because of the change that we made with how they can be used, it became necessary for those auxiliary staff that under the next rule that we'll look at can be left alone or counted in staff-child ratio. So therefore, when that occurs and that's how they're being utilized, they also need to have BFIS quality and credential accounts that are up to date with qualifications and other professional development requirements. I imagine you have questions about changes to how auxiliary staff may be used, but we'll ask this poll question and see. Are we posting the poll question? There we go. We're almost there. We'll give it a minute for a few more people to think about. All right. So about 77% of you don't have questions about how auxiliary staff can be utilized. So that's super helpful for me to know. In the last training session, most people had questions about this piece. So let's just kind of go through the highlights. So 6218 used to just contain the first sentence: auxiliary staff who do not meet qualifications shall not be left alone with children and shall not be counted in ratio. So that sentence has stayed the same. There's no change there. What is different is that the second sentence was added. Auxiliary staff of the center who hold at least a current Vermont Agency of Education license with one of the following endorsements may be left alone with children and may be counted in staff-child ratio for no more than 1 hour per day to provide education or supervision within the scope of their license. So let's unpack this second sentence just a little bit. First, this revision is in the body of the regulation, which means this applies to any center-based program regardless of where you're located. So it's not in section 8.2, it's not specific to public school pre-kindergarten programs. It does limit the amount of time that an auxiliary staff member may be with a group of children or a child. It also limits the purpose of the time. So they typically, an auxiliary staff would be left alone for the purpose of education or the purpose of supervision, unlike staff who are directly responsible for care, education, and supervision of the children. That's their primary responsibility, is all of those things for that child, that group of children. And then it identifies the required qualifications. So in order for an auxiliary staff member to be left alone with children or counted in ratio, there's 3 parts to the qualifications. One is that they need to hold a Vermont Agency of Education license. The license is required to be current. And you'll see in the next slide, I give you some examples. The rule names the endorsements that may be used. So there is many endorsements that are listed in Rule 6218 that would apply. Here, I've just given you an example of several of them. So an educational speech language pathologist, an English language learner, a music, school nurse. Those are all endorsements that people can have on their Vermont Agency of Education license. And if somebody has one of those endorsements, then they could be left alone with children or counted in ratio. So a couple practical examples of what this might look like. In a public school, it might be a child is sick and needs to go home, and now the child may stay with the school nurse in the nurse's office while waiting to be picked up. Or you might have somebody that comes in to offer a music lesson or an art lesson to a group of children, and that person could count in ratio and be left alone with the group or a child that they're providing that educational services to. This might also be used if a child is working with a special educator outside of the child's classroom. So if you want to use auxiliary staff in this way, there's several requirements that need to be followed. The first one is within Rule 6218 itself, and it's those qualifications that I reviewed with you. The next one is Rule 7122, which is the rule that requires infant child CPR and pediatric first aid be completed. This is a federal regulation that requires staff being left alone with children and or being counted in ratio to complete this training requirement. So previously, under the former rules, auxiliary staff did not need to complete the first aid and CPR training requirements because they weren't being counted in ratio, they weren't being left alone with children. If you have auxiliary staff and you want to use them in this new capacity, then they will have to have the CPR and first aid training. The next rule would be Rule 713, which is the orientation rule. This is also a federal regulation, just like CPR and first aid. If a staff member is being left alone with children or counted in ratio, they're required to complete the orientation training. And many of you might be aware that there's two ways of meeting the orientation requirement. One way is to have staff complete the Better Kid Care Vermont orientation online, or you can create your own version of the orientation that you deliver yourself with staff as part of their onboarding process. If you want to create your own and you haven't before, on the CDD website, on the Forms for Providers webpage, you will find a template that talks about what needs to be included in your orientation. There's a checklist to reflect how you're covering each of the required items. There's a sign-off document that you can utilize that staff and yourself verify that all of the training requirements that are required in Rule 713 have been covered. Either one of those two options, it's important to remember that the mandatory reporter training that's online that needs to be completed is a separate requirement from the Better Kid Care orientation and needs to be included. If you're doing your own orientation, they still need to complete that online mandatory reporter training. I just highlight that because sometimes we see that staff have completed the orientation, but they haven't completed the mandatory reporter training. So you want to make sure as part of 713 that they're getting both met. So you saw a couple slides ago that center-based rule 3473 was the one that said within 6 months, a staff's BFIS quality and credential account is up to date. Because auxiliary staff, if they're going to be left alone with children or counted in ratio, do have that educational requirement in Rule 6218 to say that they have a Vermont Agency of Education license. You'll want to make sure that they send either their diploma or college transcript and their AOE license with any other professional development documents to Northern Lights at CCV. And they will review them to confirm they meet the criteria for those documents. And when they do meet the criteria, they'll go right ahead and upload those to people's BFIS quality and credential accounts. So I want to just highlight again, it's not required to use auxiliary staff in the capacity that they're being left alone with children or counted in ratio. And if they're not being used in that capacity, these additional requirements do not come into play. good news here before I look at the next piece is that while there are some additional professional development requirements, auxiliary staff do not need to meet the 15 hours of annual professional development. They also do not have to have the individualized professional development plans documented in their files. Becky, are there any questions I should pause and take before I?
Yeah. There's a few sort of groups of questions that have come in that I want to make sure you know about. So one is around folks who come in and take children out, like an SLP. If they pull children out of the program for those services, how should they be classified? What kind of staff person are they?
So it depends on whether or not they're employed by you. So if you have an SLP that's coming from the school or another outside agency that is their employer, then they would be defined as partner staff. In the instance where you employ them, then they would either be defined as auxiliary staff or staff. And if you're using them as auxiliary staff, you would have to decide whether or not you want to use them in the capacity where they can be left alone with children, in which case these requirements also come into play. Or you might decide that you don't want them to be left alone with children or counted in ratio, in which case they just need to complete the mandatory reporter training.
Okay, great. Another is related but a little different. So if it's in a situation where the SLP comes in and takes children to their office for therapy, do they need to have an account in BFIS?
So one of the things that comes to my mind with a question like that is, where are we referencing to? So if the parents have given written parental permission for the SLP to come and have their children leave the program and go into their supervision, then you would be signing the child out of the program. And then that person's not listed on your associated parties list at all. They're essentially a pickup person. And you have written parental permission to release that child to that individual during the time that they're working together. And in some instances, not just SLPs, but there may be other social workers or physical therapists that come and take the child off-site or outside of the licensed space to work with them or have them attend a therapy session of some sort. In that instance, you're releasing them into their custody. When they return, you sign them back in.
And just a reminder to everyone, we're seeing a couple of content questions showing up in the chat. Make sure you use the Q&A button because that allows us to kind of organize them so we can ask them in groups to Crystal. So let's see, a couple questions around documentation. So I'm going to answer part of it and then I'm going to hand it off to Crystal. So one part is, there's a question around when should they resend something to Northern Lights. So the best thing for you to do, if you've sent your documents in and it's been 30 days and you still don't see it in there, which can happen depending on the time of year especially, the next step is to contact your Northern Lights resource advisor. Depending on where your program is located, you have a Northern Lights resource advisor. Adri's one of them. If you're not sure who your resource advisor is, there's a list on our website which includes the regions that they serve. One huge part of their job is supporting you individually with your needs related to the professional development and career advising for your staff. So if you are seeking documentation and you really are like, geez, it's definitely been 30 days, it really should be in there, contact your resource advisor because they can look on the back end and they can look at workflows and see what's happened. They can see, is there a huge backlog with some conference that just got entered, or did they get put into the wrong folder for some reason and it hasn't been entered into the system yet, or perhaps there was an issue with the document. One thing that often happens is if people's email addresses are not accurate in BFIS, you may not get our communication. So our staff at Northern Lights, our staff contact people directly if there's an issue with a document, but it's based on having accurate information in your BFIS accounts. So that's one thing you could do with your staff, is make sure they've updated their contact information so that we can get them that information. So related to that, there's a couple pieces I want to hand to you, Crystal. One is if Northern Lights is behind on entering documentation, if the physical files contain all of the up-to-date trainings and information, is that enough to meet the requirement?
So if you're talking about Rule 3473 as it relates to having up-to-date BFIS quality and credential accounts, we're not looking for what you have on site. We're looking at what you've sent to Northern Lights. So licensors would contact Northern Lights after that compliance visit or complaint visit, or, and they would check in to see that those documents are indeed have been submitted and they're in the process of being processed, and at which case you met your obligation. If you're talking about a documentation needed as, for annual professional development or qualifications, again, we're looking to see that it gets sent to Northern Lights, and we're looking for that initial review process to be completed, because they hold all of the criteria to review those documents and align them with criteria. And if they meet the criteria, they enter it into the BFIS quality and credential account, and then the licensors will use that information to assess compliance with qualifications or annual professional development. So it's really about making sure that it's been sent to Northern Lights. And then the other piece that's important is, if Northern Lights has communicated with an individual that there is an issue with one of their documents or that it doesn't meet criteria, it's important that that person be responsive to that communication.
Some additional questions to try to understand when people are allowed to count in ratio, and also when they're allowed to be with children. So one, for example, can an auxiliary staff person escort children to the classroom upon drop off at the front door?
So, I would have you go back to Rule 6218 to look at whether or not you want to use auxiliary staff in that fashion. And then it's your decision to make. So if you want to have auxiliary staff be left alone with children, you'll want to make sure that they meet the qualification requirements that are in Rule 6218. And then that circles back around to the Vermont Agency of Education teaching license. And it has to be one of the endorsements. And I'm not sure how many endorsements are listed. I think there's over a dozen endorsements that are listed. If they do, then they also need to complete the CPR, first aid, orientation, those additional requirements. If that's not something that they want to do or you want to have them do, then you wouldn't have them be the one escorting the child from the front entrance into the classroom, because they'd have to be left alone, and you're not choosing to comply with those rules. So it's really it starts with you deciding how you want to use the auxiliary staff, and then you apply the rules that relate to that choice.
Okay, so in order to count them in ratio, do they need to be employed by us?
Yes, unless you go back to the definition of staff at the very beginning. And I believe that rule was 2252, yep, 53. So Rule 2253 defines staff. So unless you have a contractual relationship with another entity who is the actual employer of that individual, in that situation, you have the option to count them as, staff. Otherwise, if they're not employed by you, they're defined as partner staff.
So for an example, sort of related to that, an SLP hired by a family who comes in to work with a child would be partner staff. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. And do their orientation trainings created by a program, do they need to be approved by state licensing?
So if you go onto the CDD website and use the template that we have there and use it to its fullest extent, then you meet all the criteria. And we specifically drafted it in a way that people could use it that way, so you wouldn't have to worry or wonder.
Yeah, so in other words, there are certainly criteria they need to meet, but they don't need to submit it to you for approval before they implement it, correct?
Right, because what we would be doing during a compliance visit is we'd be looking to see how you're documenting what you're doing for an orientation, and we would cross-reference that with the regulation. If you're using our template then it's going to directly cross-reference to the regulation. If you've created your own template, again, that's fine. And staff would just make sure that all the bullets that are in Rule 713 are covered in your orientation.
Okay. Some related questions. Some of these I just am going to throw out there. Another thing to make sure you know this resource is there is you can always contact the licensor on duty. Some of these questions are very specific to your programs, and it's always okay for you to contact them. We contact them all the time to make sure we're giving the right advice when we talk to folks in the field. So I just want to make sure you know that I know that when I used to run programs, sometimes it felt a little intimidating to contact licensing, and they're really lovely, friendly humans. And I just want to sort of throw out there that you should give them a call if you have questions. So what about a partner staff person who stays in the building with a child while the rest of the class goes outside? Can they be left alone that way?
So they can, so if someone's partner staff and they're in your licensed space, they cannot be left alone with children.
And a couple of questions that have come in. Yes, it is indeed possible to email the licensor on duty. There's some more information about that in a future slide. So more information coming. Totally understand. I appreciate like having information in writing too. So a couple questions about paraeducators. And I think this really comes down to sometimes you may work in a system that has different language for what someone's job is called. And to remember that just because their job title is paraeducator, you'll still need to figure out what their role means within your program. So the questions that are coming in are around paras or aides. Can they be used in ratio?
Mm-hmm. So we don't have a position title for paraeducator. That's not a position title we recognize in the regulations. So you would have to decide if that paraeducator is employed by you and then what staff position they qualify for. And then therefore you would know how to utilize them. Classroom aides is in the regulations. Paraeducators typically what I see most commonly is they're used as a trainee or a teacher assistant. And Rule 6216 says classroom aide shall not be counted in staff-child ratio when they are performing the responsibilities of a classroom aide. A classroom aide may be left alone with a child or children to whom he or she is assigned. So they can't be counted in ratio when they're working as a classroom aide, but they can be left alone. And the reason why we've divided it up that way is because sometimes when a classroom aide has been assigned to a child, that child may need to go for a walk or go to a sensory room. And we wanted that classroom aide to be able to do that with that child.
Right.
Now that I also want to just clarify that there are times when somebody performs more than one role. So maybe a portion of the day they work as a classroom aide and the other portion of the day they might work as a teacher assistant. In that scenario, when they're working as a teacher assistant, then they can be left alone with children and certainly be counted in ratio. So you really want to be clear of when they're performing which role, and then you would know what roles to utilize for them. And then I want to maybe answer one or two more questions, and then we'll keep going. Some of the questions we're asking right now are really about regulations in general, and I really want to make sure that we take some time to finish reviewing the rules that have had some revisions.
Yeah, I think that these can wait if there's time at the end.
Okay. That sounds great. The last thing I wanted to say about auxiliary staff is I wanted to just come back to Rule 335 and 336. These are the rules that require the mandatory reporter training that's online. And these rules haven't changed. It has always said licensee staff and auxiliary staff. We see a fair number of auxiliary staff that haven't completed this training. So I just wanted to take a second and highlight that for you all. And then we've talked about some different aspects, and I want to just cover some resources that are available to you. So we're going to put in the chat box, if we haven't already, the link to the center-based, the CDD website. There are pages on our CDD website that are useful resources related to both staff and auxiliary staff. And one of the web pages is devoted to BFIS. And on this particular webpage, there is a whole variety of documents that support your use of BFIS and or your staff's use of BFIS. So there's documents about logging into BFIS for yourself or staff or auxiliary staff, and or how to access individuals' BFIS quality and credential accounts. There's also guidance on how to submit documentation to Northern Lights at CCB to be reviewed, and for those documents that meet the criteria to be uploaded to individuals' BFIS quality and credential accounts. So that's one web page that has a variety of resources. The others is our forms webpage, and there is also a variety of different sample forms or forms that you would need. So it starts off with background clearance forms. And what I'll say about this is every once in a while, we do need to update that form. And when we do, for legal purposes, we have to ensure that the form that we receive is the current version that we have. So sometimes programs will print off the form, make copies, keep the copies in a file, and just pull them out of the file when they need them. I'd ask you not to do that. If you need a copy of the form, print it off from the website. That way, if we change it, you don't have to worry about us sending them back to you, letting you know that the form has been updated and you're not using the current form. There is a section on the forms webpage titled Staff / Volunteer Forms. It's towards the bottom of that page. And in that section, there are sample forms for acknowledgement of mandated reporting responsibility statement. So the regulations say that people have to sign off that they understand their responsibilities as a mandated reporter. So there's a sample statement that you could utilize with staff. There's a sample staff file audit form affidavit that you could use with staff. I said audit, I meant affidavit. There's the template to the Vermont Child Care Regulations required orientation. So if you wanted to create your own orientation and you want to use a template to be able to do that, that's there. I think one of the other really important documents on that forms webpage is at the bottom. It's called the Centerface Due Date Checklist, which includes a variety of things like who needs to do what, when, and how often. So if you're trying to keep track of what do auxiliary staff have to do for professional development, what does staff have to do, what does the program director have to do, what does the licensee have to do, all of those things are listed in a kind of checklist format, and it says what has to be done, who has to do it, and by when, and do they need to renew it? And if so, how frequently? So you'll see places there under the section that says mandatory reporter training, it'll say staff and it'll say auxiliary staff. And then you might get the section where it says CPR and first aid, and it'll say staff, or it'll say auxiliary staff that count in ratio and or are left alone with children. So we really tried to be very concrete. What I will say about the forms, the sample forms, is we haven't had a chance to update the website with all the revisions to those forms based on these center-based regulations that have come out. Give us a couple more weeks and then those forms will be up there. So we'll have revised all the forms. So the enrollment form will have the home language piece on it. The checklist I was just talking about will differentiate between auxiliary staff being left alone with children and counted in ratio. So those forms are super handy. You're welcome to change them, use them, create your own, but give us a couple of weeks and then we'll get the revisions up there. The last piece of the CDD website that I think is a particularly helpful resource is the professional development webpage. On that webpage, there's a link to the Northern Lights at CCB's website. There is the Northern Lights at CCB like professional development hotline if you have questions. There is also a webpage link from that page for licensed required trainings. So again, you'll find information about the Vermont orientation training. And if you want to create your own, there is the link to the online mandatory reporter training. There's criteria that goes over which types of first aid and CPR, or emergency response trainings, or medication administration training criteria, so that if you want to, you always want to make sure you double check what the criteria are, and that the training you're planning on taking meets that criteria. Your resource advisor is great about helping you with that, but if you want to go to the webpage, you can see that there. All right. I'm going to pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions about any of that. All right. So I'm going to step away from staff now and switch back to other revisions that we've made. And this one is about evacuation drills. This rule starts the same. So the first part says, the first sentence says, the licensee shall ensure evacuation drills are conducted at least once a month. And so that is the former rule. That language hasn't changed. The part that has changed is for those center-based programs that are located in a public or independent school building. For those particular programs, they may count a lockdown drill performed by the center-based program in place of an evacuation drill. And the reason why we made this revision is that public schools and independent schools have additional drill requirements to the evacuation drill. They have to do lockdown drills, and there is a schedule that they have to follow with how many they do and how frequently. And so for programs located in school buildings where the schools are performing these additional drills, this provided an extra layer of requirements. So this was our way of streamlining that requirement and aligning it with what is already required. And so if you're located in a public school or independent school building and they do a lockdown drill while your program is in operation, you may also count that lockdown drill that month in place of an evacuation drill. And this was a revision that was done in collaboration with both the public school pre-kindergarten stakeholder work group members, but also the Division of Fire Safety and the Agency of Education. Division of Fire Safety is an authority that has a responsibility to ensure the safety of children in school buildings. Certainly so doesn't the Agency of Education. And so we really looked for alignment when we wrote this revision. The things that I would just highlight here is if this applies to you because you're located in a public school building or an independent school, it's important to know that at least 3 of the drills during that school year are still evacuation drills, so they can't all be lockdown. It's also important to remember the rule that comes right after this, Rule 3723, which requires one of the evacuation drills to be during nap or rest time. And so that rule still exists. So if you're located in a public school or independent school building and you're counting the lockdown drills, you do at least 3 of your drills are evacuation drills. At least one of those 3 needs to be during nap or rest time. The next rule that we made a revision to was Rule 562. First sentence stayed the same. What we did was we added the second sentence. With written parental permission, a school-age child. And if you question like who's considered a school-age child, you would want to go to the definition section of the regulations and look up the definition for school-age child because it tells you how to define that. But a school-age child may self-medicate under the direct supervision of staff who meets the training requirement within this rule. And this was an example of the guiding principle that the division uses. If a rule really should be the same across environments. If it's good for children and there isn't a difference across environments, then it should be the rule in every place. And this is an example where the after-school regulations as part of the 2016 revision had this second sentence and we didn't catch it. And we didn't include it because of that. We didn't include it in the center-based regulations or the family child care homes. So during this regulation revision, we've added it to align it. And this rule really brings us back to talking about the, Vermont's focus to ensure children in schools and in childcare are drinking water that's really lead safe. So in 2019, the Vermont legislature wrote a bill that Governor Scott signed that requires childcare programs in schools test the drinking water for lead. The statute authorizes the Vermont Department of Health to regulate and monitor this testing and require that the test results be posted on the public website for all citizens to access. So that's what the statute says. So as part of that process, the Vermont Department of Health wrote the regulations that govern what needs to be done for lead water testing and what those are standard for the way the test is conducted, where the results are posted. And so what we did here in our center-based regulations was utilize this revision process to align the language in our regulation with Vermont Department of Health. So now they're exactly the same. And you're going to see not only the change here, but you're also going to see the alignment of the language both in the initial application section of the regulation, in the annual assurance section, and in license renewal. I'm just going to pause for just a second to see if anybody had any lead water testing questions.
Okay, there's one question that came in. Is the testing requirement behind? I was told pre-COVID I needed to test and never received anything.
Right. So Vermont Department of Health wasn't completely through the testing process when the pandemic started in March. So they started testing in, I think it was like July or September of 2019. And by March, they were most of the way through testing and implementing testing for everybody. The pandemic happened. So they paused on testing. They've now contracted with the Endyne Lab. That was several months ago. I want to say it was probably June or July that they contracted with Endyne to assist with processing the water test. And we're slowly resuming the implementation process for testing. They did have a deadline to complete all of the lead water testing by December of 2020, but in light of the pandemic, they did get a statutory extension through to December of 2021. So they are doing lead water testing for any new applicants. They've now added back in lead water testing on taps where they didn't, they had, their test results exceeded the limit and they remediated. And shortly they will be resuming a lead water testing for those programs that hadn't been tested yet.
Another is a question around how often does water need to be tested?
So the Vermont Department of Health has that regulation, and I believe, and you would have to check with them specifically, but I believe it's like every 3 years and there's different schedules. So I'm going to leave it broad so you have a concept, but I can't tell you specifically. I don't remember the specific regulation on that.
Another person's asking for other examples of evacuation drills besides fire.
So the evacuation drill, is the fire drill. They're one and the same. We do try to be a little bit careful about the language because for schools, they also have to do an off-site evacuation. I think like once a year. I don't know the exact schedule. But for our regulations, evacuation is of the building. And that's why it says you need to be able to have everybody out of the building within 3 minutes. Based on life safety codes, that's what's been identified to ensure the preservation of life for all children and adults. Great. All right. So another rule that has been revised is this rule 510232. It's a new rule. Prior to this 2020 revision, we required that all perishable foods be kept in refrigerators, would not allow them in lunch boxes. And I want to just back up and tell you a little history here. During the 2016 revision process, there had been a lot of requests to allow perishable foods to be stored in lunch boxes. And so during that revision process, we researched, what does the research say about what's best for children? And at that time, the research continued to reflect that refrigerators was the safest place for children's food to be stored. So as you can imagine, we had survey comments that said, can we now, make a change to this revision? And so as part of this revision project, we did research it again. And between a shift in the research and the continued development of lunchboxes and ice packs that improve the ability for keeping the food at the right temperature, the right chilled temperature, we felt like this was an appropriate shift at this time. So the key parts of this requirement is that the lunchbox is required to be an insulated lunchbox. So not a metal or a non-insulated box or bag, but one that is insulated. The insulated lunchbox is required to have 2 ice packs in it. So if you find that a lunchbox, parents are putting 1 ice pack or no ice packs, then you still need to take that perishable food and put it in a refrigerator. So it is important for you to think about, if you're going to utilize this rule, that your staff have a process for checking lunchboxes. You don't want to make assumptions about whether or not they're insulated or that there's the 2 ice packs in there. I will still say that best practice is a refrigerator. And so, this is an example of a regulation that's more of a foundational standard than best practice. If you decide that you want to continue using refrigerators and not allow for this option, that's fine too. I want to circle back to staff for a little bit and talk about substitutes. So in this revision, CDD added the word consecutive. So the rest of the rule says exactly the same thing it said before, but now we said for 30 or more consecutive days. And this was really in recognition of the challenges with staff requirements and the impact of this on recruiting substitutes. So this requirement was loosened as a result of this revision. There are several rules this change impacts. So it says the same thing in annual professional development, individualized professional development plan, annual performance evaluations. It all says in there, reference to substitutes that are working less than 30 consecutive days are exempt from those things. They don't have to do 15 hours of annual professional development. They don't have to do individualized professional development plans, and they don't have to do annual performance evaluations. So it says it right in those particular rules. And this rule certainly applies to all center-based programs.
Just because I want to make sure that I'm answering this correctly, there's a question that came in. Will they let us know when we're due for lead testing again? I'm assuming they mean the lead water testing. Is there any other sort of lead testing that I might be mixed, that they may need to pay attention to, or is it just the lead water testing that the health department is responsible for?
So we were talking about lead water testing, but there also is buildings that are older require essential maintenance practice. And so that's once a year, ensuring that lead paint is still intact and hasn't been compromised. And if it is, it needs to be remediated. So those are 2 different things. Both are regulated by Vermont Department of Health, and our center-based regulations just mirror their regulations. Okay. So the next regulation, in the last one, I think we'll specifically focus on it. This is Rule 62742, and it talks about restricting a child's movements. And we added in all of the bolded language. So restricting a child's movements or actions through use of physical force. So physical force was added. Binding, tying, use of any other mechanical restraint, or using medication without written parental permission, without following the medicine's label, and or without following medical prescription. And I'll just pause for a second and see if you have any questions about this one.
A couple of repeat questions, but I'll type those answers in.
All right.
There is a lunch question though. I'm not positive I know the answer, so I want to make sure that I put this out to you. Was the regulation for lunch boxes including staff lunches?
The regulation is about children's lunches. We don't regulate staff's lunches. Although I would say encourage your staff to be safe. So while you're thinking about what other questions you may have, I have another poll question for you. To what extent do these revisions provide appropriate flexibility to your program? Are you seeing practical applications for your program? We got at about 80%. Okay, we got almost everybody. So it looks like 65% of you feel like there's, a moderate flexibility to your program. That's great. Thank you. What other questions do you have before we move on to next steps?
Okay, one came in about physical restraint when a child is exhibiting unsafe behavior.
So that's a great question. And what I would do is also have you, so this rule that the rule that this one is in is under a section header. So 6274 is the section header, and it says no form of inappropriate discipline or corporal punishment. So it's really talking about when you're using restraint for discipline or corporal punishment. When you have a child who is unsafe, harming themselves or has the potential to harm other children, and they're throwing a chair or climbing up the furniture and jumping off from it, and they're just really unsafe. There may be a need to guide the child out of the room or redirect them over to another activity or provide some other kind of calming response to them. And in that instance, you're not disciplining the child. You're not using an inappropriate form of discipline or corporal punishment. You're really just trying to keep the child safe. What is important to recognize when you're doing that, and there is physical touch involved in that, is making sure that families know about that. When we do get reports of concerns from families, it's oftentimes because they didn't know that that was happening with their child, they didn't consent to it, and maybe they have a different parental philosophy. So that's definitely one piece to consider. You also want to consider what level of training staff have had to use any kind of physical touch like that with children. Without proper training, there's always the potential risk of harming the child, while you may be good intentioned. So that's another factor. But this is really when this would be cited would be when we see or staff tell us about like grabbing a child by the wrist and pulling them along because you want them to sit because they're, you know, throwing something, or you want them to leave the room, or you come up from behind a child and, you know, grab them as a body hold, and you're telling them they cannot be behaving like that. At that point, you're not guiding their behavior, you're not scaffolding or coaching their language skills or coping mechanisms. You're really disciplining them, and that's when this would be a factor and play into it.
Okay, so is the division considering creating a licensing addendum regarding the current regulation of assistant teachers working with assistant teachers, given the pandemic and its impact on our staffing abilities, even for a short time? And they note that this has been a significant topic of discussion at leadership group meetings.
So I think the rule you're referring to is the rule 6243. It says the program director shall ensure that each group of children is led by a staff member who is at least qualified as a teacher associate for at least 75% of the hours of operation. And the reason I go to that rule is because two teacher assistants can work together. There are times in the day where that would happen, lunch breaks, beginning of the day, end of the day, depending on how you staff that classroom. So there isn't a requirement that a teacher associate is leading each group of children 100% of the time. So I think what you're talking about is there been any consideration around decreasing that percentage? And I don't think we've seen very many variances during the pandemic around asking for that particular rule to be modified. What we have seen and continue to see pre-pandemic and certainly during the pandemic is allowing teachers who otherwise meet teacher assistant qualifications to be allowed to be counted as teacher associates. And with those qualification variance requests, there is usually an education plan for how that teacher will complete the needed education to meet teacher associate. And then based on that education plan, we've typically, in a lot of instances, approved those variances. So I think that's more of what we've been seeing. And some of it has stemmed from the challenges with finding and recruiting qualified staff. And so that's something we've been supporting for the last several years.
Yeah, and I do want to sort of encourage, if any of you are, if that particular question resonated for you and you're thinking about staffing in your programs, sometimes what happens is as you're thinking about hiring a new person or considering someone for a different position in your program, you can send those transcripts to Northern Lights and we can review them for you and let you know what role the person meets the coursework and degree qualifications for. So we sometimes have directors who will send us a resume and say, this is my current whatever staff person. What would it take for them to be qualified as a teacher associate? And we can do a look at that at the transcript and give you some information about what it would take. And then a lot of times what directors will do is use that information we give in their variance request to licensing. So just to know that that's another resource Northern Lights can play if you're trying to think about staffing and you have some staff that you think maybe that is going to be next on their career pathway, that they're interested in qualifying as a teacher associate. What might it take to get them there? That's a place that we can provide some support.
The other thing that I will say is what's really important when you're looking at filing a qualification variance is making sure that you've really aligned the length of time that variance is needed with what needs to be done and balance it out. We really want as much home work-life balance for staff as possible. It certainly minimizes burnout. And so Typically, if someone needs 2 courses and then they'll meet teacher associate qualifications, if you put in a request for 1 semester, so maybe it's August and you're putting a variance request in for them to complete those 2 courses by the end of December, we typically will extend that a year. We'd rather, if they finish it in 1 semester, that's great. But we don't want to put that burden of responsibility that they have to take 2 courses in 1 semester. We'd rather them take 1 course a semester. So just really think about what's practical. In a couple instances, we've seen qualification variances in which there's a number of courses that need to be taken. And so it's likely they're going to need more than 1 year because variances are time limited. Typically what we will do is we will grant that variance. If we're going to approve it, we'll grant it for 1 year. At the end of the 1 year mark, we'll identify in the conditions what needs to be met for milestones. And then if at, towards the end of that year, those milestones have been met, you can request an extension for another 6 months or year for that individual if they still need more time. So again, we really want to make sure that the length of time is really doable and realistic. I will say that a lot of people have taken advantage of the qualification variance option for people who are just shy of the teacher associate qualifications to be able to be named as a teacher associate in a program and therefore be present in that classroom 75% or more of the time. And we've been pretty liberal with approving those just to support the field.
Yeah, a couple of follow-ups from that same person that related to the COVID-19 guidelines for illness. If sometimes there are going to be extended periods where teachers need to be absent and they may not have the coverage to meet that regulation of 25% per day. And what should they do in those situations? Should they in fact close the classroom if that's the case?
So a couple different thoughts come to mind for me. One is, when you see that you have a staff member that is going to need to be out for an extended period of time, I would encourage you to call the licensor on duty line and talk about what you think your plan is. And the licensor will help you be able to think through how do the regulations impact that plan? Does it completely align? Does it align almost, but with this one little piece? And they will help you strategize through that. So that's definitely one piece. It's important to know that staff are going to be out sick. That's understandable. That's why you have substitutes. And so unless you're going to be having a substitute cover for somebody for more than 30 days, that's covered under the current regulations. If it's really, they're going to be out for longer than 30 days and there's going to be a hardship around meeting the substitute qualification because it says 30 or more consecutive days, then the substitute has to meet the position for which they're covering. So if they're covering for teacher associate and they don't meet those qualifications, and that's a particular hardship. Maybe they're fine on annual professional development, maybe they're fine on first aid and CPR. It's just that added qualification piece and you need like 2 more weeks or another month, that may be an appropriate situation for a variance. So there's always different ways of balancing your program's needs with the regulations. And like I said, the licensor on duty line is a great place to kind of talk that through.
So what is the process to request a variance extension?
So if you've been granted a variance and you find that you need, another month or another 6 months, depending on the scenario, you would send your licensor an email asking for an extension on that variance. The licensor will add that information, will collect the information they need. They'll add it to that open variance. And then when they have all the needed information, they pass it forward to their supervisor for final review. And the supervisor would issue a new variance decision letter. I will say, keep it easy on yourself. You do not need to submit a new variance when you have a pending, an open variance. Like we'll just keep the same one going.
Okay, so the rest of the questions are an assortment of things. Some are not related to the revisions, but still might be helpful if you have, it looks like we have a little bit of time, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So To be clear, CIS staff would need to show proof of completing the mandated reporter training, but do they need a BFIS quality and credential account?
So anybody that's being listed in your program's associated parties list, either as partner staff, auxiliary staff, staff, when we add them to your associated parties list, if they don't already have a BFIS quality again or credential account, we automatically open one for them. So people have one whether they realize they have one or not, about 9 times out of 10. They do get email notification. Whether they ever set up that login or not is up to them. You can, once we add somebody to a program's associated parties list, whoever has login access to the program's BFIS program account. So typically those are like the licensee, maybe a program director. Sometimes there might be a third person, like if you're a really large program, maybe you have a business manager who enters all of the subsidy attendance for you. So they might also have login access because they're entering all of that attendance. So whoever has login access to the program's BFIS account, they can see the associated parties list. They can always click on credential account. What's important to know, and many of you probably already know this, but if you don't, it's helpful to know that the quality and credential account of an individual travels with the individual. So if they've already taken the mandated reporter training, or they have a current first aid and CPR, or they've sent it to Northern Lights, maybe 6 months ago and it's good for another year, when you add them to your associated parties list and you click on their credential account, you can see what's already in there for professional development. So that's one of the beauties of, and that revision, I want to say we made that change to that process in I think it was 2017, so that program directors and licensees can see what's in their staff's quality and credential account. And that basically becomes like an online electronic account for you to keep track of all of their documentation.
Okay, so am I correct that a triple E special educator cannot be inside the building while everyone else is outside?
So I'm probably going to start to sound a little bit like a broken record, so I'll have you bear with me. But again, it's not about what they do or what their professional title is. It's about how you use them as it relates to the regulation. So they could be a triple E teacher, they could be a paraeducator. If you're using them, if they meet the definition of staff, they're employed by you, you're using them as staff, either as a trainee, classroom aide, teacher assistant, however, whatever position title the capacity with which you're using them, it's going to be those rules that relate to that. And when you look at the center-based due date checklist that's on our CDD forms webpage, you're going to see that it really identifies which requirements different staff positions need to hold. So you're going to want to think about how you're utilizing them. If you're not in a staff position, but you're utilizing them as auxiliary staff and they're employed by you so that they can be used as auxiliary staff, again, you then get to decide whether or not you use them in ratio and allow them to be left alone with children. If so, there's a certain set of professional development and qualification requirements that they need to comply with. If you don't use them that way, then you might have an auxiliary staff member who is a cook and they prepare the meals, and you don't ever want them to be left alone with children or counted in ratio. In that case, all they need to have is the mandated reporter training online. So you really want to come back to the regulations. And again, if you want to make sure that the way you're thinking about how you're using staff aligns with the regulations, a quick email or call to the licensor on duty line can help clarify that for you.
I was just amused because the next question I'm going to ask you is about a cook in a program. So can my cook give a staff member a bathroom break as long as another staff is present in the classroom?
So you want to come back to the regulation for auxiliary staffs, 6218, that says, clarifies that they can only be left alone with children or count in ratio if they meet those requirements, qualifications, 1 hour, those pieces. I think the thing that you're thinking about is well, there's a couple different scenarios, but one of them is you have two staff working in a classroom and one of them needs to use the bathroom. They can leave the room for a minute and go to the bathroom and come back. Like, you're not out of compliance with ratio. What becomes an issue is, they go to the bathroom and then they stop to talk to a parent in the hallway, and then they remember they want to grab some art supplies. And by the time it's been like 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then it's like their role is no longer with providing the direct care and supervision to the children that they're supposed to be providing. So that may become a problem. But just running to the bathroom, use the bathroom, come right back, that's fine. If you only have one staff member in that room, you do want to make sure that somebody meets staff qualifications is covering for them, whether it is somebody who's considered a floater, so maybe they meet trainee or teacher assistant qualifications. So you don't want to leave the children unattended. But a cook isn't going to meet they might, I guess they could have a Vermont Agency of Education license, but that particular profession isn't listed in those endorsements.
Thank you.
Mhm.
How do I access my staff's BFIS quality and credential accounts as a director?
Yes. So as a program director, if you have been given, if the licensees approved you to have program access, you log into the program's BFIS account, you see your associated parties list, you see the person's name on the left, on the right, you see the word, I think it says credential case. You click on credential case and it opens it up for you. Really that easy. I love it.
Great.
And while you're looking for the next question, I think the other thing that I really want to highlight, since the 2016, it's taken a long time for everybody to ensure that their staff's quality and credential accounts are up to date and current with qualifications and professional development. Now we're seeing many, many more have. So when we're doing compliance visits, we're going through all the staff's quality and credential accounts, and we're assessing what they meet for qualifications. And we're doing what's called a one-touch process. What that means is we look at what they have in there. Do they have a resume in there? Do they have a transcript, a high school diploma? Do they have a credential certificate? We cross-reference what they have in there against the regulations, and we do it for all three types of regulations: after school, center-based, and family home. And we identify the highest position that their qualifications in their credential account aligns with. So maybe they meet registered family child care home provider qualifications. In a licensed family home, maybe they meet teacher assistant qualifications. In a center-based, they might also meet teacher assistant qualifications. And in an after school, they meet program staff. We list that. The great thing about it is when you click on their credential account and we've assessed that for them, you can see that assessment and you can see what we think they already meet. If they've done additional education and it's time for us to reassess, you could reach out to your technician and ask them to do that reassessment. Your child care business technician, they can do that for you. The other thing that's really handy is that once we've made that permanent finding in their credential case, it speaks to your program's BFIS account. So it looks at what it is: a center-based program license, after-school license, a family child care home license, and it looks at the position title, and it looks to see if it matches the highest position title listed, and it'll say yes or no in the qualification column. So you list them as a teacher associate, but the documentation we saw in the credential case really aligned with teacher assistant. It'll say no in that qualification column if we've made that assessment. So now that we are having many more credential cases that have all those documentation in there, we're doing more of those assessments, and you'll start seeing yeses and nos pop up for staff, and that lets you know. But again, you can see what we've made for a finding.
And Crystal, are you still, apologies if you just said this, but are you still doing those as you're preparing for a licensing visit, or might the technicians be doing them at another time as well?
There's a whole variety of times in which we do that. We would do it at a compliance visit. If you submit a variance request for qualifications, we would look at it. If there's a complaint investigation, if you're busy updating all of your staff and you've called your childcare business technician and asked them to do it, they would do it then. So there's a whole host of times when we might be doing that.
Great. Okay, because one of the questions was how, someone in one of their staff has enough has enough college credits to be listed as a teacher associate, and who should they contact to update that. So they either could wait until it doesn't necessarily have to be updated yet. The yes or no piece doesn't have to be, or they could contact their technician who could support them with that if there was time. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So another question came in about understanding, receiving an up-to-date copy of the regs. So my understanding is each program has received one hard copy, and I'm going to paste a link as an answer to your question. I'm going to paste the link to the digital version, which is the one that I use, 10 times a day probably. So I know that, and then I'll let you expand on the printed piece.
Yes, yes. So I think I'm going to move right into talking about next steps, because there's more about resources and information sharing, and I'm happy to continue to come back to questions. But first I want to talk about what your next steps could be. So, and one of the things I want to share with you is that there is a document on our CDD website, and it's titled Summary of Changes to the Center-Based Regulations effective September 1st of 2020. And this document actually shows you all the regulations in which a revision was made, a substantive revision. Like if we fix the typo of a word, I don't know that it's listed in there, but any of the ones that I've covered are listed in there. And there's other ones that had some type of change that I didn't talk about today. So that document is just the regs that have had some revision to it. So it's a quick, easy read, and it can help you identify. One of the things we saw when we revised the regulations in 2016 is that there was regulations that people hadn't been aware of. And so they thought they were new in 2016, when in reality it was the same rule. Sometimes it was worded exactly the same way, but they'd been around for so long and you might not have read them. So this is just a nice way to do a self-check. If you think something's changed, you can reference it. And I think we're putting the link to the center-based regulation webpage in the chat box, right?
Yeah, I put it in as an answer to the question. So folks, if you click into the question and answer, you can see the questions that have been asked and responded to. So I did pop it in there. If you need it, we can also paste it into the chat. You should, hopefully, if this is working the way it should, you should be able to see it in the question and answer section. Another question came in about how to know who their technician is. So I'm pasting in the page on the CDD website, which lists the contact information for all the staff, including a link so you can click to see who the licensing staff are that are assigned to each part of the state. Because this is one of those resources that's best to know where the website is, because if they hire different staff, that information will change, but they can keep it up to date on this page for you.
So the page that Becky's talking about will have two different documents that you can open. One is an alphabetical list of all the towns. And in the alphabetical list, beside your town, you can see who your assigned licensing field specialist is, as well as your childcare business technician. At the bottom of the page, it identifies each of the supervisors and the staff that they supervise and their contact information. If you click on the name of the person, it populates their email address in your emails. There's also a map of the state. So for those of you who are like visual maps and colors, that's another way you can tell. The other thing that is a good next step is to really read through the revised regulations and identify any that is going to impact some kind of change that you want to make in your program, and identify that. And part of that developing the action plan is also identifying what order you plan on making those in. Probably best to start with the ones that are going to be a little bit more labor intensive, so you give yourself more time to do those. And then obviously what goes hand in hand with that is then implementing your action plan. What's important to remember is that you're going to really want to make sure that you're in compliance by December 1st. This is a much lesser lift than the 2016 because we were just revising and tweaking. We weren't overhauling. After 20 years, you end up with an overhaul. You do it every 3 years. it's much more mild. And in this particular case, we were building in more flexibility. So then I want to talk a little bit about the division. There's lots of things that we've been really busy doing, implementing for revisions to the regulations over the last several months. So this has included posting the revised regulations on the CDD website, including that summary page that I talked about. We mailed a copy of the revised regulation to each center-based program. Because of the pandemic and budget constraints, we're not able to give extra copies out at this time. We're hoping at some point in the future that would change. But for right now, we're able to afford to send each program one copy of the revised regulations. We entered all of the revised regulations into the BFIS data system so that we can continue with our licensing site visit reports, variance requests, and a whole host of work that we do in there. We've updated the licensing frequently asked questions section on the CDD website. We provided a training to all of our childcare licensing staff on this. And we've reviewed and drafted edits to all the sample forms and checklists on the CDD website that are impacted by these revisions. While we've certainly made a lot of progress in our action plan, we still have several pieces of our action plan that we're still working through. So in the next week, by the end of this week, we'll have been provided another training for other center-based program directors and licensees. The second training is during the day. And we're also going to provide a training for public school administrators, so principals and superintendents. Last week, we provided a training for early childhood coordinators who work for public school systems. In the next couple weeks, we plan to update the forms and checklists on the CDD website. So I mentioned that we've gone through all of them and compared them against the regulation revisions and made updates and edits. So now we need to post those to the CDD website. So that'll be in the next couple weeks. And in the next week or so, we will have filed our update to the Child Care Development Block Grant state plan. So the federal funding that we receive to cover the Child Care Financial Assistance Program requires that we have what's referred to as a state plan. And in that state plan, I think it's like, I don't know, 300 pages. There's like 6 sections. It's a long plan. We have to account for how we meet every single federal regulation. And not only do we have to describe how we meet it, but we have to cite all the sources that back up what we've said. So I've gone through and edited that state plan as it relates to the regulations and made sure that the regulation number changes that have happened. There's not a lot, but there's a few. So we'll be updating that state plan. And then our final step, so there's the state plan. Our final step is to revise the center-based guidance manual. And that's going to take us another month or so to finish the revisions to the guidance manual. Once we finish those revisions, we will post it to our CDD website, and we will also be mailing a copy of the new guidance manual to every program, every center-based program. So that's what we're up to. And then I just wanted to share some of the regulation resources on our CDD website. So one is so that one of the things on that webpage is the center-based regulation book, like Becky mentioned. So you can always access electronic copy that way. The other document that's right beside it is the summary of changes. So that supporting document is there. You're also going to find some frequently asked questions. So we reviewed all of those. We actually reviewed them for after school and homes, and we've, anything that's now covered in the guidance manual has been removed, or if, the answer has changed because we're in a different state of implementing regulations, and we've updated that, and certainly any revisions that impacted center-based regulations has been updated. So that's there for you. Not to confuse this with the licensing COVID FAQs, frequently asked questions. That's in a separate web page, and that's still there.
I
Then
just
you're
want
off.
to have you clarify one thing because there was a question that came in about that. So, as any changes continue, we don't know how long COVID's going to be something we need to worry about, but it looks like it's going to be here for a while. So, as any information, guidance, changes come from licensing related to COVID, where should folks look to find that information?
So when you go on to the CDD website, I believe it's at the top of the webpage, there is a COVID link. And if you click on that COVID link, it brings you to the COVID section of the CDD website. And in that COVID section, there is a multiple different resources. There's resources on supplies. There is information about the health guidance. So it links you right to the health guidance. There's a licensing section. In that licensing section are two, I think, important documents. One is the licensing COVID frequently asked questions, but the other one is what to expect during a licensing visit. So we are doing compliance visits now in person. And so if you look at the what to expect during a licensing visit, it will let you know what the licensor has done to prepare. You know, they've gone through their health check before they leave their home. They've taken their temperature and documented that. They have certain cleaning supplies and hand sanitizer that they use in the car. There's certain expectations about them washing their hands upon arrival between going from one classroom to another. So that document is certainly really informative. And I think there's a connection to the Agency of Education website for pre-qualified pre-kindergarten programs. Those are the things that are coming to my mind, but that's there. And so we keep updating that. And when we do updates, we continue to send out notices so that you have that information.
Great. And there's a couple of very specific questions that have come in, and I just want to encourage folks to really please use the licensor on duty or call your licensor for clarification. In situations where you're talking about a very specific person and a very specific program, the answers might be just as specific because the licensor needs to interpret the whole situation. So rather than answering them in front of this entire group where their experience might actually be a slightly different answer because of different circumstances. To avoid confusion, I would just really encourage you to, I will certainly pass all these questions along to Crystal anyway, but I just want to let you know, I'm not going to ask all of them live because I do think in some cases, the best thing you can do is ask your specific question either to your licensor or the licensor on duty.
So I just want to wrap up of what else is on the CDD regulation webpage. It certainly has the guidance manual there. And then the last thing that's on that, and you heard me talk about it earlier, was the future regulation revision suggestion survey. We did take that survey down when we were going through the public comment period for the revised regulations. That's a formal promulgation process. And we wanted to make sure people didn't confuse surveys. But now that the regulations revision has been implemented, we've reactivated that survey link. So anytime you see a regulation, I do this myself. It's a great storage place of ideas. You think a regulation that needs to be revised for whatever reason, you can put it right in there. And like I said, when we do a revision process, we start there and we pull what we get for information. And I know we only have a few minutes left, so I do want to kind of circle back around to our learning objectives. And I think this is our last quick poll to check in. How well did we meet our learning objectives? We're getting there. Almost everybody's responded. So it looks like there's an overwhelming number of you feel like we met them. That's super. Glad to hear that. I know we've referenced the licensor on duty line multiple times, but we'll put the phone number and the email address in the chat box. I do hope you explore the CDD's website and utilize the resources available there, but the licensors continue to staff the licensor on duty line. They cover it Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 4:30. They answer any and all regulatory questions you may have. It's a great time to find out that you're not doing something correctly, because now you have time to know it and do something about it before we come for a compliance visit. Really discourage people from waiting until their compliance visit to ask if they're about a regulatory question. The reason I say that is oftentimes we're nervous during a visit, and we'll find that someone might shift their practice because they're concerned about whether or not it meets the regulation, and they might have been doing something that was fine, but in the moment, in trying to think about what to shift it to, they shift it to something that isn't in compliance. So ask those questions. We have people that contact us on a regular basis. Whether you contact us once or on an ongoing basis, whatever works for you. One of the things that we added about a year ago was the email address. It's a feature that I think really helps a lot of programs have more access to us. If you're leaving a message or sending an email and you really want to chat with us about something, you can always leave us a good time to call you back. The licensor that's covering that is their sole responsibility that day. Usually they return calls or emails within an hour or two. Typically every call and email is responded to that day. I mean, I suppose if you call at 4 o'clock, we might not be able to get back to you. We'll get back to you first thing in the morning, but it's not an emergency response line though. So you really want to make sure that you have a really good emergency response plan so you know what to do in those emergencies. But it is a good way to kind of think through a lot of the specific questions you have. And then before we say goodbye, I just want to acknowledge, I mean, this has been certainly, a pandemic has been a huge education for all of us. And many of you have, been providing care and education and meeting children's needs and families' needs from the very beginning. Some of you restarted in June, some of you just restarting, but all of what you're doing has made such a huge difference. And I just really appreciate the role you've played. I also want to thank everyone who assisted with this regulation revision project. There was many public school pre-kindergarten program personnel that attended. There were other stakeholders like Champaign Valley Head Start that attended. We had representation from Agency of Education. We had guest visitors from Division of Fire Safety, Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont Department of Health that came in and talked about different regulations. And so super appreciative of those collaborations. And then I just want to say thank you for joining me for this couple hours and talking about these